Hello and welcome to a conversation with Dr. Shrinath Reddy. He is the head of the Public Health Institute of India and also one of the people on the National Task Force in managing COVID. Welcome, Dr. Reddy, for this conversation that we've had a couple during COVID times. I would just like to, ask, first of all, begin by asking you to update our viewers as to where we are in COVID. Everybody's saying third wave, Delhi is badly hit. Exactly how we are placed, what is happening, if you can just help us.
Well, it's very clear that with the advent of winter, increasing pollution levels, as well as far greater mobility of people crowding into public places, as well as even in private events, North India in particular is far more vulnerable, and we are seeing the manifestations of that. Elsewhere too, we are seeing the result of a great deal of crowd mobility and opening up. And therefore, it's not surprising to see that whether we want to call it second wave or third wave, or even before the wave has subsided, there is a bounce back. Whatever way we want to call it, we are still seeing the virus quite active. And it has been spreading into different parts of the country too, into smaller towns. And therefore, we are definitely seeing the presence of the virus, and we need to take far greater care than we have been doing so far.
Yes, I heard you say there's been a lot of laxity in lockdown. Is that only to blame, or the fact that with winter the virus gets stronger?
Well, I think we could not have carried on the lockdown as such, but then a certain amount of discipline being exercised by the people themselves, as well as a stricter enforcement and regulation by the authorities would have helped. If we allow a number of super spreader events to take place, then we pay the price, because we are allowing the virus a free rein. But I believe the environmental factors like cold weather and increasing pollution do play a role, because of variety of reasons in which the cold operates, both in terms of giving the virus a longer life on the surfaces, as well as depressing the people's immunity. There are multiple reasons why in cold weather we actually see a much greater effect of the virus. And pollution, of course, adds to it.
Okay, but now also we are at a stage where now vaccines are being discussed. So it's actually, slightly positive note than when we last met. We've seen the various versions that are there in the market. Which one do you think should India be looking at best? Which has the best chances for us?
The results are preliminary, interim, and not even actually submitted to the regulators. Right now, they are only in the form of announcements by the various manufacturers. Okay. Nevertheless, there is some element of promise, and that must give us hope. But while waiting for the regulators to really scrutinize the results of completed trials and not just interim trials, we need also to look at what are the operational feasibility issues. Not safety and efficacy are paramount. I mean, ultimately, they are non-negotiable. Duration of protection is the other element, which is helpful, but it cannot be determined entirely in the course of a trial. It sometimes takes longer to do that. But after safety and efficacy are determined as beyond reasonable doubt, and if duration is promising from the trial results, then the next thing is, what is the feasibility? What are the operational barriers? And how easy is it to procure or produce the vaccine in large amounts in an affordable manner, and how easy is it going to be to distribute it across this large country with a vast population. So there, I believe the two vaccines which earlier made the news in terms of the mRNA platform vaccines, the AstraZeneca, of course, being the new one, but that's not the mRNA one. But the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine as well as the Moderna vaccine, which were the mRNA vaccines, are really not feasible for us because of the requirements of very severe sub-zero temperatures for cold chain, both for preservation as well as transport at minus 70 degrees for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and at least minus 20 degrees for the storage component of the Moderna vaccine. And even the price also becomes a bit of a formidable barrier. So other than procuring, if need be, for small quantities for select groups of people, these vaccines are really not going to be useful for mass immunization in India. So we have to look at other ones. And the third one that has come up is AstraZeneca, which is feasible both from the point of view of the storage requirements of temperature as well as the distribution chain. And it's also likely to be less expensive for us because it is being produced in part by the Serum Institute of India under license. So that stands as a potential candidate, but we still have to see the results. There have been some rather curious media announcements made about the dosage schedule and the differential efficacy of the different dosage schedules. So there are some questions that still need to be answered related to that particular vaccine. Then we also have some claims about the Russian vaccine, which is also being tried out in India now in terms of trials, but they also claim success. So we'll have to wait and see also how our own vaccines, which have been developed in India and are being produced in India, will also turn out, like the Bharat Biotech vaccine as well as the Zydus Cadila vaccine. But among the front runners, if the AstraZeneca stands scrutiny in terms of scientific results, then it might be far more feasible for us to use that rather than the two mRNA vaccines.
Thank you. It's a very comprehensive overview, and I have a whole lot of questions also. But first, the basic. What exactly is mRNA? Can you explain that to our viewers? Because we're reading these terms in the media, but if you can explain it to us, break it down.
When we look at the genetic code, we are all familiar with the deoxyribonucleic acid, or the DNA.
Right.
Now, as a part of that whole process in which the genetic code is instructing the manufacture of various proteins in the body, there is a messenger RNA, which is also produced as a part of the genetic machinery. And that messenger RNA, which is a single-strand genetic material, as opposed to the double-stranded DNA, is called the mRNA. So it's part of the genetic machinery of the cell.
Okay. And you also said that, we need to take a look at the safety and the efficacy. Now, the efficacy is something everybody is pronouncing, but anyway, the regulator will also look at it. Safety is something that we can't evaluate. We don't have the time for that because, once you take it, how long does it have any after effects? Would that be a worry for you?
See, safety has to be demonstrated in different stages of the trial. Phase 1 and phase 2 are initially done on human volunteers, and there is some initial safety result obtained there as well. Okay. But the numbers are not large enough, and then you do the phase 3 trial for efficacy and also for safety. But there are some effects which may not be fully manifest during the course of the trial. For that, you have to do also post-marketing surveillance after the product has been licensed and is being used. You get much larger numbers of people who have had the vaccine, and even then you have to keep a big watch on it. Like, for example, the dengue vaccine, which was previously used, once it started getting used after the initial permissions, then only when very large number of people were actually studied, then it was observed that what was called an antibody-dependent enhancement, which was an adverse effect, was manifested. So we need to keep that watch then anyway. But at least the preliminary promise of safety must be there in the trials completed up to phase 3. Then, of course, efficacy has to be demonstrated as well in terms of how much protection is being conferred by the vaccine to the immunized people, in terms of how few infections have happened in the immunized group as opposed to the non-immunized group.
Okay. And just to get back to the RNA question, you're saying some vaccines are based on that, but some are not. So what are the others based on then?
Well, basically, as I said, that the genetic material of the virus is being utilized in the mRNA vaccines, whereas some of the genetic material, part of that genetic material is utilized sometimes to be induced into a inactive and relatively harmless virus called the adenovirus. In this case, therefore, the genetic material incorporated into another virus helps to transport it into the human body cells and then elicits the the antibody response, the immune response against the genetic material of the virus. It's not the complete virus by itself.
Okay.
Whereas some of the vaccines are using inactivated viruses, which are completely inactivated, but nevertheless the virus itself. And interestingly, what has happened is that in the AstraZeneca, for example, they've used chimpanzee viruses in which they've introduced the genetic material, part of the genetic material of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So you can actually have different platforms in which you can elicit the same immune response to the genetic material of the virus, either by using the mRNA of the virus or by using part of the genetic material introduced into another virus, which is harmless, or a completely inactivated SARS-CoV-2 virus itself can be used as the stimulus for producing the immune response.
Okay, thank you so much. And also, Doctor, the distribution of the virus, there's a whole lot of, as to who should be prioritized. Of course, everybody's saying healthcare workers is the first priority. Then there is an argument saying don't just go for demography, don't go for the older lot, but also a younger person with comorbidities should also get preference over maybe an older person who's actually just staying at home. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there are two issues to be looked at: the essentiality criterion and the vulnerability criterion. And the essentiality criterion suggests that the people who are both most likely to be vulnerable to the infection, getting infected, and who are also essential, the essentiality criterion is that the people who are absolutely essential for maintaining services like health services, or other essential services, they should be prioritized first. And some of them happen to be vulnerable too, like the healthcare workers are likely to be vulnerable also because of repetitive exposure to the virus. The second is purely the vulnerability criterion, where you are saying, okay, elderly people are more likely to be susceptible to very severe forms or even fatal outcomes if they are infected. So because of that vulnerability, you should actually protect them much more. Or people with comorbidities are the ones you need to protect much more because they are likely to have bad outcomes. So that is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is who are vulnerable to the infection rather than bad outcomes. Those are the young people who are moving around, people in the working age group, or people who are studying. So they are the people who are much more likely to get infected. So why not immunize them first? And then they, in turn, will not infect others then, including the elderly. So those are arguments that can be made. And but at least one thing is sure. The first is the essentiality component will have to be filled in terms of ensuring that healthcare workers as well as other essential workers, including security personnel, they would need to be protected first. And then comes the choice of how you're going to proceed as a mix of both essentiality and vulnerability.
So there's going to be a whole lot of, data and to be worked out really, I think our government has already begun on this. We've also had a lot of new rules that are coming in, some people are saying, this lockdown at night, it doesn't make sense. So, or do you think that there is actually a rationale behind it? It'll stop the partying, it'll stop the socializing.
Well, this has been mostly based on Western experience when people have been congregating in bars and nightclubs and then eating out in restaurants, partying outside. And therefore, the feeling was that those kind of activities at least should be stopped. Whether that is a big problem in India, it is difficult to say, but certainly in some of the large metropolitan areas, people staying out late and partying or at least dining out, that is not unusual, and therefore at least that can be curbed. But the more important thing is, I think, is to signal to people that you are likely to be vulnerable to exposure to cold weather, and in the nights, if the temperatures are dropping, you're more vulnerable. Therefore, try and protect yourself even from that point of view.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, but I want to come back and talk to you about, the COVID itself. What are the, the symptoms one should watch out for? Because with our health system being so overfull, if there are any tips you can give to people to look out for, to know, whether it's self-medication or to be wary of, what are the things one should avoid? So stay with us, but after a short break, we're going to be back. Hello and welcome back to a conversation with Dr. Shrinath Reddy. Dr. Reddy, before the break, we were speaking of vaccines and various things, but now about COVID itself, the virus, the infection itself. Are there any, because, we know the whole system is overworked. First of all, the cures as to what really you think is working, because now there's been a lot of apprehension about steroids, for instance. A lot of patients are wary of taking steroids, but doctors say, no, this is a game changer, even more than, say, a plasma therapy, because there you don't know how much is the titer of antibodies. What would you say in that sense, in terms of what seems to be working?
Well, this is where clinical trials help, because when there is uncertainty, you need to do good clinical trials in order to find the right answers. Steroids should not be used indiscriminately, and certainly people's apprehensions about widespread steroid use are justified. However, there are certain conditions where the immune response, if it gets out of hand, can be controlled by steroids effectively. What the trials have shown is that in people who are in hospitals and are particularly on oxygen or on ventilator, that means they're fairly seriously ill, in them, the immune response has actually gone into an exaggerated mode and is likely to cause serious problems in terms of fatal outcomes. And steroids there can help in controlling the out of gear immune response and ensuring that people don't end up with a fatal outcome. And that is what has been shown in the trial Recovery, where deaths in hospitalized patients who are on oxygen or on ventilators were reduced by the use of steroids. And this is a short-term use. It's not a long-term use. On the other hand, in the initial phase of the infection or in persons with mild manifestations, where the natural immune response is coping fairly well in combating the virus, steroids may depress the immunity and may cause harm. That's why the message has gone out that don't use it in mild cases, use it only in severely ill people who are hospitalized. And there it does save lives. So I think we don't have to be apprehensive about steroids as a general treatment. We shouldn't misuse it, but where necessary, we must use it.
Okay. And what about, Remdesivir and the earlier protocol, that thing that we spoke about, you think is still, there's a template kind of, you take paracetamol if you have symptoms. When you're in hospital, they kind of give you plasma therapy, Remdesivir, and maybe, other kind of steroids or antibiotics.
Well, I think in the initial stages, or even till recently, people were struggling with trying to find some method of treating people because there was no certainty about what works in this new virus. But as trials are being completed, we are getting more information about what works and even what doesn't work. Like, for example, Remdesivir. The initial promise came from US trials. One of them said, okay, treating for 5 days or treating for 10 days is okay in terms of reducing the hospital stay.
Right.
Now, that particular trial was initially started to find out whether it makes a difference in terms of saving lives, in reducing deaths. But they did not find that effect because their sample size was not adequate and the effect was not impressive enough in terms of demonstrating that it saves lives. They said, okay, it reduces your hospital stay. But even there was a problem because the number of people in the trial were not large, just about 1,000. It so happened by chance alone that the people who were in the Remdesivir arm were less sick than the people who were in the control group. Less of them were in the intensive care. Less of them were on ventilators. Less of them required other forms of therapy, which are generally considered for sick people. So if you have one group which is less sick and the other group which is more sick, you can naturally the hospitalization time also may be reduced in the group that is less sick. So there was nothing really conclusive coming out of that trial when properly examined. So Remdesivir is still under a question mark. Does Remdesivir work in very mild cases, in out-of-hospital management of such cases? We do not know. No trials are being done. Maybe we may see some effect, we may not see some effect. But at the moment for hospitalized cases, Remdesivir is out of the protocol. That's why WHO has said it's not working for such patients. And they've unequivocally stated that for hospitalized patients, it should not be considered.
And what about post-COVID symptoms? A lot of people are saying that even if, apart from fatigue and all, there is a worry that it impacts your lung, your heart. There's a lot of blood clotting. Do you have now enough time to study these symptoms? Do they stay for long? Are they stay for only a month, or is that something that you're going to be permanently? You're going to be facing recurring symptoms like that?
Again, the information is accumulating, and unless we study large number of people, we'll not be able to really find out what proportion of people have these kind of long duration effects. We are really dealing with people who are hospitalized or who might have even stayed at home with some symptoms. But there are many people who are discovered now on antibody testing to be infected and who are asymptomatic, and who continue to be asymptomatic. So what are the long-term effects in them? So we still do not have all the answers. However, we now know that in a certain proportion of people, it does appear to have long-term effects, both in terms of lung lesions where the lungs have fibrosis, also in terms of the heart, where the heart muscle seems to be suffering from myocarditis or inflammation, or even sometimes the virus seems to be attacking the muscle fibers of the heart. It seems to be having other impact also, like for example, it affects the pancreas and can cause diabetes. It can affect the brain in terms of not only brain fog, which may last for a few weeks, but also other longer lasting effects. So there are many other impacts that are coming out of this virus lasting for several weeks. Now, will it last for several months? Will it last beyond the year? Nobody knows, because still it's a new virus. But the fact that it's not going to go away in a week or 10 days for some of the people affected is very clear. So studying these people who are called long haulers, or this condition called long COVID, is now becoming an important element, and many hospitals and health services are starting special services for such people. This is apart from the mental health effects of COVID infection. But one of the common elements that seems to be very prevalent in larger number of people is severe chronic fatigue. That has been known in other viral infections too, but seems to be much more debilitating and longer lasting in this virus infection than in many other virus infections.
Why is that? Have you figured out why is this having this kind of an impact?
Well, we do not know. This is certainly a more virulent virus than the common flu virus, and it seems to result in a fair amount of effect on the nervous system as well, including people who have lost smell, and that may persist for some weeks. So whether the fatigue is the effect of on the general metabolism, or is it on the muscles, it's not clear. But definitely the muscle tone seems to be altered, and the sense of fatigue comes in. But the fatigue can also come in when the lungs and heart are affected, not just the muscles. And therefore, that's another reason why you have fatigue.
Okay, and before I let you go, are there any tips on how one should build up their immunity? Everybody's trying all sorts of things, I think apart from the cocktail of vitamins and Ayurvedic cures, is there anything that you would just like to give us some tips to the viewers?
Well, nutritious food in terms of lots of fruit and vegetables is going to be important. Then eating nuts is also helpful, because it does give you some additional nutrients which are not there in fruits and vegetables. So a combination of fruits and vegetables and nuts would generally give you good immunity. And plenty of sleep is going to be very helpful. And if you can manage good sunlight without getting into highly polluted air, then you can certainly build up some vitamin D and get some help there as well. So those are the things that we need. And while we keep waiting for the vaccines, I think it's very important to recognize that innate immunity is also important, natural immunity, and this is the way to do it.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for taking time out and speaking to us and explaining it breaking it down really so we can all understand what is happening, or try and understand what's happening rather. Thank you so much for this conversation.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.